Sarah Martinez had never imagined that her Tuesday morning would begin with loading bullets into her service weapon. The coffee in her kitchen had grown cold hours ago, untouched on the counter as she stared at the ransom note that had arrived with the dawn. The paper trembled slightly in her weathered hands, not from fear, but from the rage that had been building inside her chest since she first read those terrible words. "We have your boy. Come alone to the old warehouse on Miller Road. No cops, no backup. Just you and whatever courage you think you have left." 23 years as a police detective had taught Sarah many things about human nature. She had seen the worst that people could do to each other, witnessed cruelty that would haunt most people for the rest of their lives. But nothing had prepared her for the moment when that cruelty reached into her own home and snatched away the most precious thing in her world. Her son Danny was only 16 years old. He should have been getting ready for school right now, probably complaining about his math test or asking for money to buy lunch with his friends. Instead, he was somewhere in the hands of the Crimson Riders, the motorcycle gang that had been terrorizing their small town for months. Sarah knew exactly who was responsible. Marcus Steele Rodriguez had made it clear during his arrest 6 months ago that he would make her pay for putting him behind bars. She remembered the cold smile on his scarred face as the judge sentenced him to 5 years for armed robbery. He had looked directly at her from across the courtroom and mouthed the words, "Your family will regret this." The legal system had failed them. Steele had been released on a technicality just 3 weeks ago, some mistake with the evidence that his expensive lawyer had exploited. Sarah had felt sick to her stomach when she heard the news. Knowing that a dangerous man was back on the streets with a personal vendetta against her, she had tried to protect Danny. After Steele's release, she had driven her son to school every morning and picked him up every afternoon. She had warned him to stay close to his friends and never walk alone, but teenagers think they are invincible, and yesterday Danny had decided to take a shortcut through the park after his guitar lesson. That was where they had grabbed him. The warehouse on Miller Road was perfect for an ambush. Sarah had been there before during drug raids. It was an old industrial building surrounded by empty lots and abandoned factories. The Crimson Riders had been using it as their headquarters since they arrived in town, turning it into a fortress where they could conduct their illegal business without interference. Sarah checked her weapon one more time. Her Glock 19 was loaded with 15 rounds and she had 2 spare magazines tucked into her belt. She also carried her backup gun, a small revolver that she kept strapped to her ankle. As a police officer, she was trained to never go into a dangerous situation without proper backup. But this time was different. This time it was personal. The drive to Miller Road took 20 minutes through the industrial part of town. Sarah passed rusted factories and empty parking lots, remnants of better economic times when this area had been bustling with activity. Now it was a ghost town, the perfect hiding place for criminals who wanted to operate in the shadows. As she approached the warehouse, Sarah could see at least a dozen motorcycles parked outside. The Crimson Riders were known for their distinctive red and black Harley-Davidsons, custom bikes that cost more money than most people made in a year. The sound of engines revving and loud rock music drifted through the air, along with the smell of motor oil and cigarette smoke. Sarah parked her car about a block away and walked the rest of the distance. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. Years of training had taught her how to control her emotions in dangerous situations, even when everything inside her was screaming with worry for her son. The main entrance to the warehouse was a large sliding door that stood partially open. Through the gap, Sarah could see the bikers gathered around a makeshift bar that had been set up against one wall. There were about 15 of them, all wearing the leather jackets with the Crimson Skull logo that marked them as members of the gang. Steele Rodriguez stood in the center of the group, easily recognizable by the jagged scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He was a big man, well over 6 feet tall with massive arms covered in tattoos. His long black hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and he wore the same cold smile that Sarah remembered from the courtroom. As Sarah stepped through the doorway, the laughter and conversation gradually died down. One by one, the bikers turned to look at her, their faces showing a mixture of surprise and amusement. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, and she looked almost comical standing alone in the entrance of their stronghold. Well, Steele said, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "Look what we have here. The famous Detective Martinez has come to pay us a visit." Sarah said nothing. She slowly reached inside her jacket and drew her service weapon, holding it down at her side. The movement was deliberate and calm, showing none of the fear that the bikers expected to see. The reaction was immediate. Several of the gang members burst into laughter, slapping their knees and pointing at the small woman with the gun. To them, she looked like a toy soldier trying to intimidate a battalion of real warriors. "Did you see that, boys?" One of them called out. "The little lady brought her pop gun to a party. Maybe she thinks she's in some kind of Western movie," another biker shouted, causing another round of laughter. Steele held up his hand for silence, but the grin never left his face. "Detective Martinez, I have to admit I'm impressed. When I sent you that note, I wasn't sure you would actually have the courage to show up. But here you are, all alone, just like I asked." Sarah's eyes scanned the warehouse, looking for any sign of her son. She could see several rooms at the back of the building, and there were stairs leading to a second floor where Danny might be held. But she knew she had to be careful. One wrong move and both she and her son could end up dead. "Where is my boy?" she asked, her voice cutting through the lingering chuckles from the crowd. Steele's smile widened. "Oh, he's safe for now. But whether he stays that way depends entirely on you, Detective. You see, you cost me 6 months of my life, and I think it's time you learned what that feels like." The bikers began to spread out, forming a loose circle around Sarah. She could see the weapons they carried, knives and chains and brass knuckles that glinted in the dim light, filtering through the warehouse windows. They were confident in their numbers, certain that one small woman could not possibly pose a threat to their entire gang. But Sarah Martinez was not just any woman, and they were about to learn exactly what kind of mistake they had made. The warehouse fell into an uneasy quiet as Steele Rodriguez studied the small woman standing before his gang. Sarah Martinez had not moved from her position near the entrance, but something about her posture had changed. The nervous energy that might have been expected from a desperate mother was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she stood with the calm confidence of someone who had been in dangerous situations many times before. "You know, Detective," Steele continued, walking slowly around her like a predator circling its prey, "I spent a lot of time in that prison cell thinking about you. 6 months of sleeping on a hard cot, eating terrible food, and dealing with guards who treated me like an animal, all because you couldn't mind your own business." Sarah's eyes followed Steele as he moved, but she kept her weapon pointed toward the ground. She was outnumbered 15-1, and any sudden movement could trigger a violent response from the gang, but she was not intimidated. Her training had taught her that in situations like this, patience and timing were more important than speed. "I was just doing my job," Sarah replied, her voice steady and calm. "You robbed 3 convenience stores and threatened innocent people with a gun. What did you expect?" The other bikers laughed again, but this time the sound was more forced, less genuine. There was something about the way Sarah spoke that made them uncomfortable. She did not sound like a frightened mother begging for her child's life. She sounded like a professional who was assessing a tactical situation. "Your job," Steele spat, stopping directly in front of her. "Your job destroyed my life. Do you have any idea what it's like to be locked up with murderers and thieves? To have your freedom taken away because some cop decided to play hero?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I know exactly what it's like to have your life destroyed by criminals. I've been fighting people like you for 23 years. I've seen what you do to innocent families, how you spread fear and violence wherever you go. So forgive me if I don't feel sorry for you." The honesty in her words seemed to catch Steele off guard. He had expected tears, pleading, perhaps even offers of money or favors in exchange for her son's safe return. Instead, he was facing a woman who showed no fear and refused to be intimidated by his threats. "Tough talk for someone who's completely outnumbered," Steele said, gesturing to his gang members who had now formed a complete circle around Sarah. "What exactly do you think you're going to accomplish here? Even if you manage to shoot 1 or 2 of us, the rest will tear you apart." Sarah allowed herself a small smile. "You're probably right about that. But before we get to that point, maybe you should know a little more about who you're dealing with." She reached slowly into her back pocket with her free hand, making sure her movements were visible to everyone in the room. The bikers tensed, expecting her to pull out another weapon, but instead she withdrew a small leather wallet. "My name is Detective Sarah Martinez," she said, flipping open the wallet to reveal her badge. "But that's not all I am. Before I became a police officer, I spent 8 years in the United States Marine Corps." The laughter from the gang died away completely. Several of the bikers exchanged glances. suddenly looking less confident than they had moments before. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan, Sarah continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. I was part of a special unit that hunted down Taliban leaders in some of the most dangerous territory in the world. We went into places where most people wouldn't last 5 minutes, and we always came back with our targets. Steele's cocky expression was beginning to fade, replaced by a look of growing concern. Military veterans were common in the criminal world, and he knew better than most how dangerous they could be. During my time overseas, Sarah went on, I learned some very specific skills. How to track enemies through hostile territory, how to survive when outnumbered and outgunned, how to eliminate threats quickly and efficiently. Most importantly, I learned how to stay calm under pressure and never give up, no matter how hopeless the situation might seem. She took a step forward, and instinctively several of the bikers took a step back. The confidence that had filled the warehouse just minutes before was rapidly evaporating. After I left the Marines, I joined the police force because I wanted to use those skills to protect innocent people. For over 2 decades, I've been hunting down criminals who think they can terrorize honest families. I've arrested murderers, drug dealers, rapists, and thieves. I've been shot at, stabbed, and threatened more times than I can count. Sarah's eyes swept across the circle of bikers, meeting each of their gazes in turn. But this is the first time anyone has been stupid enough to threaten my family. The warehouse had become completely silent except for the distant sound of traffic on the highway. The gang members who had been laughing and joking just minutes before now stood motionless, beginning to realize that they might have made a serious mistake. So here's what's going to happen, Sarah said, raising her weapon and pointing it directly at Steele's chest. You're going to take me to my son right now. You're going to release him unharmed, and then you're all going to get on your motorcycles and leave this town forever. Steele tried to maintain his composure, but sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. And if we refuse? Sarah's smile disappeared, replaced by an expression of cold determination that sent chills down the spines of everyone watching. Then I'm going to show you exactly what 8 years of military training and 23 years of police experience can accomplish. She took another step forward, and this time Steele was the one who backed away. You see, gentlemen, you made one critical error in judgment. You assumed that because I'm a woman, because I'm small, because I came here alone, that I would be easy to intimidate. You thought you could scare me into submission with your numbers and your weapons. The gun in Sarah's hand never wavered as she continued to advance slowly. But what you failed to realize is that I didn't come here as a frightened mother. I came here as a United States Marine and a veteran police detective who has dedicated her entire adult life to hunting down people exactly like you. Several of the bikers were now gripping their own weapons, but none of them seemed eager to make the first move. They had come expecting to deal with a desperate woman, not a trained professional who showed no fear in the face of overwhelming odds. I've been in firefights with Taliban fighters who were better armed and better trained than any of you, Sarah said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. I've survived situations that would have broken most people, and I've never, not once in my entire career, failed to complete a mission. She stopped just a few feet in front of Steele, close enough that he could see the absolute certainty in her eyes. Today's mission is simple. I'm going home with my son. The only question is how many of you are going to be alive when that happens. The gang leader's face had gone pale, and his hands were shaking slightly as the full weight of his situation began to sink in. He had kidnapped the child of someone who was far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The tension in the warehouse had reached a breaking point. Steele Rodriguez found himself staring down the barrel of Sarah Martinez's gun, and for the first time since his release from prison, he was genuinely afraid. The woman standing before him was not the desperate mother he had expected to terrorize. She was a trained killer who had just made it clear that she would do whatever was necessary to get her son back. You're bluffing, Steele said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just minutes before. You can't take on all of us. Even if you are some kind of military hero, the math doesn't work in your favor. Sarah's expression never changed. You're right about the math. In a straight fight, your numbers would probably win. But who said anything about a straight fight? Before anyone could react, Sarah suddenly dove to her left, rolling behind a stack of old oil drums that had been abandoned near the wall. The movement was so quick and fluid that several of the bikers didn't even realize what had happened until she had disappeared from view. Get her, Steele shouted, pulling his own pistol from inside his jacket. Don't let her get away. The gang members scattered, drawing knives and guns as they tried to surround Sarah's position. But the warehouse was filled with machinery, equipment, and debris that provided dozens of hiding spots. Sarah had chosen her cover well, positioning herself behind metal drums that would stop bullets, while giving her a clear view of most of the room. The first biker to come around the corner was a young man with a mohawk haircut and arms, covered in snake tattoos. He was holding a large hunting knife and moving with the overconfidence of someone who had never faced a real opponent. Sarah waited until he was just 3 feet away before rising from behind the drums and striking him in the throat with the butt of her pistol. The biker dropped his knife and fell to his knees, gasping for air. Sarah had hit him precisely in the spot that would disable him without causing permanent damage. It was a technique she had learned in the Marines, designed to neutralize enemies quickly and quietly. "One down," she whispered to herself, then immediately moved to a new position as gunshots began to ring out across the warehouse. Steele and his remaining gang members were firing wildly in her direction, but they couldn't see her clearly through the maze of equipment and shadows. Sarah, meanwhile, was using every piece of cover available, moving like a ghost through the industrial landscape. Years of urban combat training had taught her how to use environments like this to her advantage. She knew how to move silently, how to stay hidden, and how to strike when her enemies least expected it. The bikers were tough street fighters, but they had never faced anyone with her level of tactical expertise. A second gang member tried to flank her position by climbing onto an elevated platform that ran along the warehouse wall. Sarah spotted him immediately and put a single bullet through his shoulder, sending him tumbling to the concrete floor below. The shot was perfectly placed to disable without killing, another skill she had mastered during her military service. "She's picking us off one by one," one of the bikers shouted in panic. "How is she doing this?" Steele was beginning to realize that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. This was not a desperate mother stumbling around in the dark. This was a professional warrior who was systematically dismantling his gang with surgical precision. "Danny," Sarah called out, her voice echoing through the warehouse. "Can you hear me?" "It's Mom. I'm here to take you home." From somewhere in the back of the building came a muffled response. "Mom, I'm up here. They have me tied up in a room upstairs." The sound of her son's voice filled Sarah with both relief and renewed determination. Danny was alive, and now she knew exactly where to find him. But first, she had to deal with the remaining gang members who stood between her and the stairs to the second floor. A third biker tried to rush her position, charging forward with a baseball bat held high above his head. Sarah stepped out from behind her cover and put 2 quick shots into his legs, dropping him before he could get within striking distance. Again, the shots were carefully placed to disable rather than kill. "Stop this," Steele shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You're a police officer. You can't just shoot us down like animals." Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You kidnapped my child. You threatened his life. You declared war on my family. Did you really think I would follow the normal rules after that?" She moved again, this time to a position that gave her a clear shot at Steele himself. But instead of firing, she called out to him. "I'm going to give you one chance to end this peacefully. Order your men to stand down, take me to my son, and I might let you live long enough to see the inside of a prison cell again." Steele looked around at his gang, seeing the fear in their eyes. 3 of his men were already down, wounded but alive. The others were starting to look toward the exits, clearly thinking about abandoning their leader and running for their lives. "You don't understand," Steele said, his voice becoming desperate. "This isn't just about you. There are people who expect me to handle this situation. Important people who won't be happy if I back down now." Sarah emerged from her cover completely, standing in full view of the remaining gang members with her weapon trained on Steele. "I don't care about your important people. I don't care about your reputation or your pride or whatever criminal empire you think you're building. All I care about is my son." The other bikers were frozen in place, unsure whether to fight or flee. They had come expecting to intimidate a helpless woman, not to engage in combat with a trained professional who was proving to be more dangerous than all of them combined. "Last chance," Sarah said, taking a step toward Steele. "You can either take me to Danny right now, or I can continue working my way through your gang until there's nobody left standing. Your choice." Steele's hand was shaking as he tried to keep his pistol pointed at Sarah. He knew that his reputation in the criminal world would be destroyed if he backed down now. Gang leaders who showed weakness didn't last long in his business. But he was also beginning to understand that this woman was capable of killing every single person in the warehouse if that's what it took to rescue her son. "You're insane," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can't win against all of us." Sarah smiled again, and this time the expression was truly terrifying. "Steele, I've been fighting against impossible odds my entire adult life. The Taliban had more men, better weapons, and home field advantage. But I survived 2 tours and completed every mission I was given. A few scared bikers in an abandoned warehouse? This is actually easier than what I did before breakfast on most days in Afghanistan." The remaining gang members were starting to edge toward the exits, clearly realizing that their leader had picked a fight with someone far beyond their ability to handle. Steele could see his authority crumbling before his eyes, but he was trapped by his own pride and the expectations of his criminal associates. "Fine," he said finally, lowering his weapon. "You want to see your precious son? I'll take you to him. But don't think this is over. Even if you get out of here alive, there will be consequences. People don't cross the Crimson Riders and live to tell about it." Sarah kept her gun trained on him as she gestured toward the stairs. "We'll deal with those consequences when the time comes. Right now, all I want is my boy." Steele Rodriguez walked slowly toward the stairs at the back of the warehouse, his hands raised but his mind racing. Sarah Martinez followed close behind, her weapon never wavering from its target. The remaining gang members watched in stunned silence as their leader was essentially taken prisoner by a single woman, who had just systematically dismantled their entire operation. They reached the bottom of the metal staircase. Steele stopped and turned to face Sarah. "Before we go up there, you need to understand something. Your son isn't the only reason I brought you here today." Sarah's eyes narrowed, but she kept her gun trained on Steele's chest. "What are you talking about?" 6 months in prison gives a man time to think, time to plan," Steele said, his voice regaining some of its earlier confidence. "I didn't just want revenge against you, detective. I wanted to send a message to every cop in this town that the Crimson Riders are not to be messed with." A cold dread began to form in Sarah's stomach. "What message?" Steele smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "The message that we can reach anyone, anywhere, anytime we want. Your son was just the beginning. We have the names and addresses of every police officer in this precinct, their families, their children. If you kill me here today, my associates will make sure that every single one of them pays the price." Sarah felt her finger tighten on the trigger, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was exactly the kind of psychological warfare that terrorists had used in Afghanistan, trying to make their enemies hesitate by threatening innocent people. She had dealt with these tactics before. "You're lying," she said, though she wasn't entirely certain. "Am I?" Steele asked. "Check your phone, detective. I think you'll find that you have several missed calls from your fellow officers." Against her better judgment, Sarah glanced quickly at her phone screen. Sure enough, there were 6 missed calls from her partner, Detective Mike Thompson, and several text messages marked as urgent. Her blood ran cold as she realized that Steele might be telling the truth. "While you've been playing hero in here," Steele continued, "my associates have been paying visits to the families of Officers Johnson, Williams, and Patterson. Nothing violent, you understand. Just friendly reminders that we know where they live, where their children go to school, where their wives work." Sarah's face went pale, but her grip on the weapon never faltered. She knew all 3 of those officers personally. Johnson had 2 young daughters, Williams had a pregnant wife, and Patterson was a rookie who had just gotten married 6 months ago. "You're a monster," she whispered. "I'm a businessman," Steele replied. "And right now I'm offering you a deal. You can shoot me, but if you do, my death will trigger a war between the Crimson Riders and the entire police force of this town. Innocent families will be caught in the crossfire. Children will be hurt. Is your personal revenge really worth all that collateral damage?" For the first time since entering the warehouse, Sarah felt genuinely uncertain. Her military training had taught her to always consider the broader consequences of her actions. In Afghanistan, she had sometimes been forced to let enemy targets escape because the risk to civilians was too great. On the other hand, Steele continued, sensing her hesitation, "if you lower your weapon and walk away, I give you my word that your son will be released unharmed. The threats against your fellow officers will be called off. Everyone goes home safe and sound." Sarah's mind was racing. Every instinct told her that Steele was lying, that he could not be trusted to keep his word. But she also knew that he was smart enough to understand the value of psychological manipulation. Even if only part of what he was saying was true, The lives of innocent families were at stake. "What's to stop you from just killing all of us anyway?" she asked. "Business sense," Steele replied. "Dead cops bring too much heat. Federal investigations, task forces, the kind of attention that's bad for business. But cops who have been properly intimidated? Cops who know that we can reach their families anytime we want? That's much more useful in the long run." Before Sarah could respond, a new voice cut through the tension in the warehouse. "Don't listen to him, Mom. It's a trap." Both Sarah and Steele looked up to see Danny Martinez standing at the top of the stairs. The 16-year-old had somehow managed to free himself from his restraints and was now looking down at them with a mixture of fear and determination. "Danny," Sarah called out, relief flooding her voice. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," Danny replied. "But Mom, there's something you need to know. I heard them talking earlier. They're not just threatening other police families. They've already done something terrible." Steele's face went dark with anger. "Get back in that room, kid, before I decide to forget about keeping you alive." But Danny ignored the threat, focusing entirely on his mother. "Mom, they killed someone. Last night. Officer Martinez from the next town over. They made it look like an accident, but I heard them laughing about it." Sarah felt the world spin around her. Officer Martinez was no relation to her despite sharing the same last name. But he was a good man with a wife and 2 small children. If Steele and his gang had already committed murder, then there was no way they would honor any deal or spare any lives. "You little bastard," Steele snarled, starting to turn toward the stairs. He never finished the sentence. Sarah put a bullet through his right shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the metal railing of the staircase. The shot was precise and controlled, designed to disable rather than kill. But the message was clear. "The deal is off," Sarah said, her voice filled with cold fury. "You killed a police officer. You threatened innocent families. And you kidnapped my son. There's no walking away from this." Steele clutched his wounded shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. "You have no idea what you've just started," he gasped. "The Crimson Riders don't forgive and they don't forget. This town will burn because of what you've done here today." Sarah walked up the first few steps, keeping her weapon trained on Steele, while extending her free hand toward her son. "Danny, come down here." "Stay behind me." As Danny carefully made his way down the stairs, Sarah's phone began to ring. She glanced at the screen and saw that it was her partner, Detective Thompson. Without taking her eyes off Steele, she answered the call. "Thompson, what's the situation?" "Sarah, thank God. Listen, we've got problems. Someone firebombed Officer Williams's car while it was parked in his driveway. His family is safe, but the message was clear. We think it might be connected to that gang that's been causing trouble." Sarah felt her heart sink as she realized that Steele hadn't been bluffing about the threats to other officers. The Crimson Riders really were targeting police families, and her actions here today might have escalated the situation beyond anything she had imagined. "Mike, I need you to put every available unit on protection detail for all police families immediately," she said, "and send back up to the old warehouse on Miller Road. I'm going to need some help cleaning up a situation here." "Sarah, where are you?" "What situation?" She looked down at Steele, who was still bleeding but watching her with a mixture of pain and satisfaction. He had succeeded in making this personal, in turning what should have been a simple rescue operation into something much larger and more dangerous. "I found Danny," she said, "but I think we're about to have a war on our hands." Within minutes of Sarah's call, the sound of sirens filled the air around the warehouse district. Detective Mike Thompson arrived first, followed closely by 6 patrol cars and a SWAT team van. As the officers surrounded the building, Sarah emerged from the main entrance with Danny close behind her, Steele Rodriguez limping ahead of them with his hands cuffed behind his back. "Jesus, Sarah," Thompson said, rushing over to check on his partner and her son. "What the hell happened in there?" "The Crimson Riders made this personal," Sarah replied, keeping her weapon trained on Steele despite his restraints. "They kidnapped Danny to get revenge for Steele's arrest. But it's bigger than that, Mike. They've been planning attacks on police families across the entire department." Thompson's face went grim as he looked at the wounded gang leader. "Is that true?" Steele said nothing, but his silence was answer enough. Behind them, paramedics were loading the 3 wounded bikers into ambulances while other officers rounded up the remaining gang members who had been too scared to flee during the confrontation. "We found evidence upstairs," one of the SWAT officers reported, approaching with a laptop computer and several file folders. Names, addresses, photographs of police officers and their families. Looks like they've been conducting surveillance for weeks. Sarah felt sick as she saw the scope of what the Crimson Riders had been planning. The folder contained detailed information about nearly every officer in their precinct, including work schedules, home addresses, and even the schools their children attended. There's more, the SWAT officer continued. We found weapons, explosives, and what looks like plans for coordinated attacks on multiple targets. This wasn't just about kidnapping your son, Detective Martinez. This was going to be a full-scale assault on law enforcement in this area. Danny, who had been quietly standing beside his mother, finally spoke up. They were planning to do it tonight. I heard them talking about it while I was tied up. They were going to hit 5 different houses at the same time, make it look like random home invasions. Thompson exchanged a look with Sarah, both of them realizing how close they had come to a catastrophe. If Sarah hadn't acted when she did, if she had tried to go through official channels or wait for backup, the Crimson Riders might have succeeded in their plan. What about Officer Martinez from Millfield? Sarah asked. Danny said they killed him last night. Thompson nodded grimly. We got the call about an hour ago. His car went off the road on Highway 9, but the crash investigators found evidence that his brake lines had been cut. Local police are treating it as a homicide now. Steele finally spoke, his voice weak from blood loss but still defiant. You think you've won something here today? The Crimson Riders have chapters in 6 states. We have connections that go all the way to the top. This is just the beginning of your problems. Sarah walked over to where Steele was sitting in the back of an ambulance, leaning down so that only he could hear her words. Let me tell you something about those connections of yours. I've spent 23 years putting criminals behind bars, and I've heard this same speech from dozens of tough guys who thought they were untouchable. You know where most of them are now? Either dead or serving life sentences in federal prison. She straightened up and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. But here's what's going to happen to you specifically. You're going to be charged with kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, terrorism, and about 50 other federal crimes. Then you're going to spend the rest of your life in a maximum security prison where you'll be just another number in an orange jumpsuit. Steele tried to maintain his defiant expression, but Sarah could see the fear beginning to creep into his eyes as the reality of his situation started to sink in. And those connections you're so proud of, Sarah continued. The FBI is going to use the evidence we found here today to roll up your entire organization. Every name in those files, every contact in your phone, every bank account and safe house. By the time they're finished, the Crimson Riders will be nothing but a memory. As if summoned by her words, 2 black SUVs pulled up to the warehouse. Federal agents in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, flashing badges and taking immediate control of the crime scene. Sarah recognized the lead agent, a tall woman with graying hair who had worked several joint operations with local police in the past. Agent Rebecca Torres, FBI, the woman announced, approaching Sarah and Thompson. We've been tracking the Crimson Riders for months as part of a federal investigation into organized crime networks. What happened here today just gave us everything we need to take down their entire operation. Agent Torres looked around at the captured gang members and the evidence being collected by her team. Detective Martinez, I understand you acted alone in this situation. That was incredibly dangerous and completely against protocol. Sarah braced herself for a reprimand, but Torres surprised her by extending her hand. It was also exactly what needed to happen. If you had waited for federal warrants and proper procedures, those coordinated attacks would have taken place tonight. You probably saved dozens of lives. Relief flooded through Sarah as she realized that she wasn't going to face disciplinary action for her unauthorized rescue mission. But her relief was short-lived as Agent Torres continued speaking. However, we have a problem. Intelligence suggests that the Crimson Riders have been receiving support from a larger criminal organization based in Nevada. When word gets out about what happened here, they're going to want revenge. Danny, who had been listening quietly to the conversation, stepped closer to his mother. What does that mean? Are we still in danger? Agent Torres looked at the 16-year-old with sympathy. I'm not going to lie to you, son. Your mother just dealt a serious blow to a dangerous criminal network. They're going to be angry, and they're going to want to strike back. We'll provide protection, but you'll need to be very careful for the next few months. Thompson spoke up. What kind of protection are we talking about? Safe house. Witness protection? That depends on how much intelligence we can gather from the evidence collected here, Torres replied. If we can move quickly enough to arrest the key players in their network, The threat level dropped significantly. But if some of them remain at large, she didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood that Sarah and Danny would be living with targets on their backs until the entire Crimson Riders organization was dismantled, as the paramedics finished treating Steele's wound and prepared to transport him to the hospital under heavy guard. He made one final attempt to intimidate Sarah. "This isn't over, Detective. You have no idea what kind of people you're dealing with." Sarah walked over to the ambulance one last time, but instead of responding to his threats, she did something that nobody expected. She leaned down close to Steele's ear and spoke in a voice so quiet that only he could hear her words. "Marcus Rodriguez, born in El Paso, Texas. Mother's name is Maria Rodriguez. Currently living at 1247 Oak Street, apartment 3B. Your younger sister Carmen works at a grocery store on the east side of town. Your nephew Miguel just started his freshman year at Jefferson High School." Steele's face went completely white as Sarah continued speaking in that same quiet, calm voice. "Your criminal record includes arrests in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona before you came here. You have outstanding warrants in 2 states, a gambling debt to some very dangerous people in Las Vegas, and a cocaine habit that you think nobody knows about." She straightened up and spoke in her normal voice, loud enough for the FBI agents to hear. "The thing about being a detective for 23 years is that you learn how to find information about people. Everything about people. Their families, their histories, their weaknesses." Steele was now shaking. Not from pain, but from fear. He had threatened Sarah's family, but she had just made it clear that she knew everything about his family as well. "So here's my advice," Sarah said, stepping back from the ambulance. "You cooperate with the federal investigation. You tell them everything you know about the Crimson Riders and their connections. Because if anything happens to me, my son, or any other police officer in this town, I have friends who will make sure that information about your family finds its way to some very interested parties." As the ambulance pulled away with Steele inside, Agent Torres approached Sarah with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Detective Martinez, please tell me you're not actually planning to threaten a criminal's family members." Sarah smiled for the first time since the ordeal began. "Of course not, Agent Torres. I'm a police officer. I don't make threats against innocent people." She paused, watching the ambulance disappear down the road. "But sometimes letting a criminal know that you have the same capabilities they do can be a very effective deterrent." Danny looked up at his mother with a new understanding of just how formidable she really was. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Sarah put her arm around her son's shoulders and pulled him close. "We're going to be fine, Danny. The bad guys just learned a very important lesson about what happens when they mess with our family." 3 weeks after the warehouse confrontation, Sarah Martinez sat in a federal courthouse in the state capital, watching as Steele Rodriguez was led into the courtroom in shackles. The past month had been a whirlwind of FBI interviews, evidence collection, and coordinated raids across multiple states. Agent Torres had been right about the scope of the Crimson Riders' criminal network, but she had underestimated how quickly the organization would crumble once the federal investigation began in earnest. Danny was sitting beside his mother in the gallery, having been excused from school to witness the conclusion of the case that had nearly cost him his life. The experience had changed him in ways that Sarah was still trying to understand. Her once carefree teenager now looked over his shoulder when walking down the street and insisted on texting her every hour when they were apart. "Are you sure you want to be here for this?" Sarah asked her son quietly as the judge entered the courtroom. Danny nodded firmly. "I need to see it finished, Mom. I need to know that he can't hurt anyone else." The federal prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, the defendant Marcus Rodriguez, also known as Steele, has agreed to plead guilty to charges of kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and terrorism in exchange for a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole." Sarah felt a wave of satisfaction wash over her as she heard those words. Life without parole meant that Steele would never again walk free, never again threaten innocent families, never again spread his particular brand of violence and intimidation. Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man in his 60s, looked down at Steele from the bench. "Mr. Rodriguez, do you understand the charges against you and the consequences of your guilty plea?" Steele, looking much smaller and more vulnerable in his orange jumpsuit than he had in his leather jacket, nodded silently. "I need to hear your answer." the judge said firmly. Yes, Your Honor, Steele replied, his voice barely above a whisper. And do you understand that by pleading guilty to these charges, you are admitting to participating in a criminal conspiracy that resulted in the death of police officer David Martinez of Millfield and the attempted murders of multiple other law enforcement officers? This time Steele's voice was even quieter. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Harrison then did something unusual. He looked directly at Sarah in the gallery and addressed her personally. Detective Martinez, would you like to make a statement before I impose sentence? Sarah stood up, surprised by the invitation but ready to speak. Your Honor, 3 weeks ago this man kidnapped my 16-year-old son as part of a plan to terrorize law enforcement families throughout our region. He and his organization were prepared to murder innocent people, including children, to send a message about their power and influence. She paused, looking directly at Steele, who could not meet her eyes. But what he didn't understand is that law enforcement officers don't back down from bullies. We don't negotiate with terrorists, and we certainly don't let criminals threaten our families without consequences. The courtroom was completely silent as Sarah continued. I've spent 23 years putting people like him behind bars, and I've learned that they all make the same mistake. They think that violence and intimidation make them strong. But real strength comes from protecting innocent people, from standing up for what's right even when it's dangerous, from never giving up no matter how hopeless things might seem. She turned back to address the judge. Your Honor, I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for justice. Justice for Officer Martinez, who died because this man decided that his personal vendetta was more important than human life. Justice for all the families who had to live in fear because of his threats. And justice for my son, who should never have had to experience the terror of being kidnapped by criminals. Judge Harrison nodded solemnly. Thank you, Detective Martinez. Mr. Rodriguez, please stand. Steele rose unsteadily to his feet, supported by his court-appointed attorney. Marcus Rodriguez, the judge began. You have admitted to crimes that strike at the very heart of our justice system. You have terrorized innocent families, murdered a police officer, and attempted to use violence and intimidation to place yourself above the law. The judge's voice grew harder as he continued. In my 30 years on this bench, I have rarely seen such a calculated and deliberate attempt to undermine public safety. You didn't just commit crimes. You declared war on the very concept of law and order. Steele swayed slightly but remained standing as the judge prepared to impose sentence. Therefore, I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole on the kidnapping charge. Life in prison without the possibility of parole on the conspiracy to commit murder charge, and an additional 50 years on the racketeering and terrorism charges. These sentences will run consecutively, ensuring that you will never again pose a threat to innocent people. As the bailiffs moved to escort Steele from the courtroom, he turned to look at Sarah one final time. But instead of the defiance or anger she expected to see, his face showed only defeat and resignation. The man who had once commanded a feared criminal organization had been reduced to nothing more than another number in the federal prison system. After the hearing, Agent Torres approached Sarah and Danny in the courthouse hallway. Detective Martinez, I wanted to personally thank you for your cooperation with our investigation. The intelligence we gathered from the warehouse raid led to the arrest of 43 Crimson Riders members across 6 states. We've effectively dismantled their entire organization. What about the threats against other police families? Sarah asked. Are they really over? Torres nodded confidently. With Steele and his lieutenants in federal custody, and most of their network rolled up, the remaining members have scattered. Our intelligence suggests they're more concerned with avoiding arrest than seeking revenge at this point. Danny looked up at the FBI agent. Does that mean we're safe now? Really safe? As safe as anyone can be, Torres replied honestly. There's always some level of risk in law enforcement work, but the specific threat against your family has been eliminated. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Danny asked his mother a question that had been bothering him for weeks. Mom, when you went into that warehouse alone, weren't you scared? Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. Of course I was scared, Danny. I was terrified. But being scared doesn't mean you don't act. It means you act despite the fear. I don't understand. Sarah stopped walking and turned to face her son. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is feeling the fear and doing what's right anyway. When I walked into that warehouse, I was afraid that I might not be able to save you. I was afraid that I might not see you again. but I was more afraid of what would happen if I didn't try. Danny was quiet for a moment, processing his mother's words. Is that what you learned in the Marines? That's what I learned from being your mother, Sarah replied, putting her arm around his shoulders. The moment you were born, everything changed for me. Suddenly there was something in the world more important than my own safety. More important than my own life. That gives you a kind of strength that criminals like Steele can never understand. As they reached their car, Danny had one more question. Mom, what happens now? Do we just go back to normal? Sarah smiled, but there was a new hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before the kidnapping. We go back to our lives, but we're not the same people we were 3 weeks ago. You've learned that the world can be a dangerous place, but also that there are people willing to fight to protect you. And I've learned that sometimes being a good mother means being willing to do whatever it takes to keep your family safe. She started the car and began driving toward home. But most importantly, we've both learned that we're stronger than we thought we were. And that's a lesson that will serve us well for the rest of our lives. 6 months had passed since the warehouse confrontation, and life in their small town had slowly returned to something resembling normal. The abandoned industrial district where Sarah had rescued her son was now the subject of an urban renewal project, with plans to transform the old warehouses into artist studios and small businesses. The Crimson Riders were nothing more than a memory, their former headquarters destined to become a coffee shop and gallery space. Sarah stood in her kitchen on a bright Saturday morning, watching through the window as Danny played basketball in their driveway with his best friend Marcus. The irony of the friend's name wasn't lost on her. But this Marcus was everything that Steele Rodriguez had never been. He was kind, respectful, and had been a constant source of support for Danny during the difficult months following the kidnapping. The experience had changed both mother and son in ways that were still becoming apparent. Danny had developed a maturity beyond his 16 years, showing more appreciation for his family and a deeper understanding of the world's complexities. He had also become interested in law enforcement, asking his mother countless questions about her work and expressing an interest in studying criminal justice in college. Sarah herself had been promoted to detective lieutenant, largely in recognition of her actions during the Crimson Riders case. The promotion came with more responsibility and a larger office, but also with the knowledge that she had proven herself capable of handling the most dangerous situations that police work could present. The doorbell rang, interrupting her thoughts. Sarah opened the front door to find Agent Torres standing on her porch, but this time she wasn't wearing her usual federal agent attire. Instead, she was dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, carrying a small wrapped package. Agent Torres, Sarah said, surprised by the unexpected visit. Is everything all right? Please call me Rebecca, Torres replied with a smile. I'm actually here on personal business today. May I come in? Sarah invited her inside, curious about what could have brought the FBI agent to her home on a weekend. They settled in the living room where Torres placed the wrapped package on the coffee table. I wanted to update you on the final outcomes of the Crimson Riders investigation, Torres began. Steele Rodriguez died in federal prison 3 weeks ago. Natural causes, a heart attack. He was 42 years old. Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions at the news, relief that Steele could never again threaten anyone, but also a sense of closure that she hadn't expected. I thought you should know, Torres continued, because it means the chapter of your life is truly closed now. There's no possibility of appeals, escape attempts, or revenge plots. It's over. Thank you for telling me, Sarah said. I'll let Danny know when he comes inside. Torres nodded toward the wrapped package. That's actually a gift for both of you. Something I thought you might appreciate. Sarah unwrapped the package to reveal a framed photograph showing the old warehouse district, but not as she remembered it. This was an architect's rendering of what the area would look like after the urban renewal project was completed. Where the Crimson Riders' headquarters had once stood, there was now a beautiful community center with a playground and gardens. The city council voted unanimously to name it the Officer David Martinez Community Center, Torres explained, in honor of the police officer who was killed during the Crimson Riders' campaign of terror. I thought you might like to know that something positive will come from that place. Sarah studied the rendering, imagining children playing where criminals had once plotted violence. It's perfect, she said quietly. David's family will be so pleased. There's something else, Torres said, reaching into her purse to pull out an official-looking document. The FBI would like to offer you a position as a consultant on cases involving organized crime and domestic terrorism. It would be part-time work, allowing you to keep your position with the local police, but it would give you the opportunity to help with investigations across the region. Sarah looked at the document in surprise.
You want me to work for the FBI?
Not exactly work for us, Torres clarified. Work with us. Your actions during the Crimson Riders case demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical thinking and operational courage that we need in our field agents. But more than that, you showed an ability to make difficult decisions under pressure and to see cases through to their conclusion regardless of personal cost. Through the window, Sarah could see Danny laughing with his friend as they continued their basketball game. 6 months ago, she had been willing to risk everything to save her son. Now she was being offered the chance to help protect other families from similar threats. Can I think about it? Sarah asked. Of course, Torres replied, standing to leave. Take all the time you need, but I hope you'll consider it. The country needs more people like you in law enforcement. After Torres left, Sarah sat alone in her living room, holding the FBI consultant agreement and looking at the rendering of the community center. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her partner. Detective Thompson, heard about your FBI offer? Congratulations. Whatever you decide, know that you've made a difference here. A few minutes later, Danny came inside sweaty and tired from his basketball game. He noticed the documents in his mother's hands and the serious expression on her face. Everything okay, Mom? Sarah told him about Torres's visit, Steele's death, and the FBI offer. Danny listened carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful as she spoke. What do you think I should do? Sarah asked when she finished explaining. Danny was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same seriousness he had shown in all their conversations since the kidnapping. I think you should do whatever feels right to you. But if you want my opinion, I think you could help a lot of families by working with the FBI. Even if it means more danger? More cases like the Crimson Riders? Danny nodded. Mom, 6 months ago I thought you were just my mom who happened to be a police officer. Now I know that you're someone who saves people for a living. Someone who doesn't back down when bad guys threaten innocent families. I think that's exactly the kind of person the FBI needs. Sarah smiled at her son's mature response. When did you get so wise? I learned from the best, Danny replied, giving her a hug. That evening, Sarah called Agent Torres and accepted the FBI consultant position. As she hung up the phone, she looked out her window at the peaceful street where she and Danny lived. 6 months ago, that peace had been shattered by criminals who thought they could terrorize her family with impunity. They had learned the hard way that some people refuse to be intimidated, that some lines should never be crossed, and that threatening a mother's child is the fastest way to discover just how dangerous a truly determined person can be. The Crimson Riders had laughed when she drew her gun, thinking they were dealing with a desperate amateur. They had stopped laughing when she whispered those words that changed everything. I'm here for my son. Those 5 words had contained more threat than all their weapons and numbers combined, because they represented something that criminals could never truly understand, the absolute determination of a parent protecting their child. Now, as Sarah prepared to begin a new chapter in her law enforcement career, she carried with her the knowledge that she had been tested in the most extreme circumstances possible and had emerged victorious. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dangerous criminals she might face in her new role with the FBI, she knew that she had already survived the worst thing that could happen to a parent and had come out stronger on the other side. The bikers had laughed when she drew her gun, but Sarah Martinez had gotten the last laugh, and she would continue laughing in her own quiet way. Every time another criminal discovered that threatening innocent families was the biggest mistake they would ever make.